What's a girl to do when she's stuck between men who each represent a different narrative around how our culture believes that romance should be approached? Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, created by Aline Brosh McKenna and Rachel Bloom, follows the story of Rebecca Bunch's journey of self-actualization. And central to that journey is her constantly shifting romantic dynamics with three men in her life: Josh Chan, Greg Serrano, and Nathaniel Plimpton. Each of these relationships is used to examine and deconstruct a different kind of love story, and in so doing help the audience to understand that in spite of any appealing qualities these stories may have, they ultimately are not paths that lead to realistic, healthy relationships. And so, with that understanding, let's start by discussing the man who set this whole crazy machine into motion,
Joshua Felix Chan.
The meant-to-be is the most common and iconic kind of love story. It's the type of story you see in fairy tales, the things that we're all exposed to since the time that we're able to comprehend narrative structure. It's about two people who are perfect for each other, tied together by the threads of destiny, always finding their way to one another. And because it's the most idealistic kind of love story, it's also the one that's easiest to undermine. And undermine it, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does. Josh and Rebecca's chance encounter in New York seems like something that could only be a product of fate. But when she moves to West Covina, we can see immediately the way that she and Paula have to contrive arbitrary situations for the two of them to have any interaction. The first and most pressing issue is that Josh is in a long-term romantic relationship with Valencia at the beginning of the series. And in fact, he's the only member of the love quadrangle to be in a relationship when they're introduced into the story. But even without Valencia as a factor, it's dubious whether Josh has any real interest in having a relationship with Rebecca. Particularly after he learns that Rebecca fakes the burglary in her own apartment, he's wary of whether he can actually trust her and whether it's wise to spend time with her, independent of Valencia's objections. Feeling like you need to bring a group of friends to act as a social buffer is not exactly soulmate behavior. And while certainly if Josh was not interested in Rebecca at all in this time, he wouldn't have gone with her in the first place, but he's very clearly keeping her at arm's length. And that's a trend that continues throughout season 2 when he and Rebecca are actually together, because as much stock as they both publicly put into the power of the relationship, he always has one foot out the door, whether it's because of guilt over his betrayal of Greg or uncertainty about Rebecca's history. And in order to maintain any semblance of that meant-to-be feeling, Rebecca has to constantly micromanage their relationship. The clearest example of this is Rebecca's decision to push up the wedding, which is in one part motivated by her guilt over her attraction to Nathaniel, but in truth, the biggest motivator is her fear that Josh will stop loving her once he finds out who she really is. And it would be reasonable to think that after the fallout of the wedding and everything that happened in the first half of season 3, that the Jebecca ship has fully sank. And it's perfectly reasonable that a lot of viewers were caught off guard when Josh announced his rekindled affection for Rebecca. But it's clear to me that any attraction he feels towards Rebecca after undergoing his own personal journey of self-discovery is just a reflection of the fact that he's ready for any romantic relationship at all, and Rebecca just happens to be there. Which is why it's also significant that he's the only member of the love quadrangle to be in a romantic relationship in the finale. It's a clear representation of the fact that any spark that may have existed between him and Rebecca didn't really have anything to do with either of their feelings about the other person. It was always about them trying to fulfill their own internal longings for a connection. And that's the sticky thing about destiny. If you want something badly enough internally, it's pretty easy to convince yourself that it's meant to be.
Why not settle for me?
The narrative that Greg is meant to deconstruct is one that I see popping up a lot in more modern rom-coms. And while it can take a variety of different forms, the central quality of it is that there is a supporting character that is much better suited to be in a relationship with our romantic lead and has to watch them pursue someone else for the duration of the story. Once the central relationship blows up in our romantic lead's face, they realize that they've been taking this character for granted and that they were the one that they truly loved all along. Often, the right-under-my-nose character is seen as an unlikely choice because they are in some way opposite to our romantic lead. In the case of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Rebecca's naive idealism is contrasted with Greg's extreme cynicism. But when they finally get together, they balance out the extremes of each other's personalities. Rebecca learns to see life a little bit more realistically, and Greg learns how to experience joy. But the truly important thing that Crazy Ex-Girlfriend explores with this trope is the extreme levels of self-loathing that are necessary in order to watch someone you love be with someone else in hopes that they'll give you attention someday. And while Greg outwardly rejects the notion that he is someone that Rebecca would be settling for, he always knows on some level that Rebecca sees him as a backup option. When the high of the new relationship is fresh, he is briefly able to let go of his anxieties that Rebecca isn't really choosing him. But Josh is immediately able to get under his skin and cause him to pull away from Rebecca. While deep down he wanted to give Rebecca a romantic experience at Jaima's wedding, his own insecurity caused him to reject her before she had the chance to pick Josh over him. And when they have a heart-to-heart in Season 2, he expresses directly that he only was interested in her because he felt like he couldn't actually have her. That he felt like he didn't deserve happiness, so it made sense to pursue someone who wasn't truly interested in him. And his departure to attend Emory Business School is his realization that in order for him to be happy someday in a relationship, he first needs to learn how to prioritize himself.
Strip away my conscience, peel away my values, rip off my compassion with your teeth.
He was a boy, she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious? The I can fix him narrative often acts as a subcategory of one of the first two that we've discussed, but I think it's interesting to examine the way that Rebecca handles it particularly. For starters, it's an interesting twist in the sense that Rebecca's pursuit of Nathaniel was at first motivated specifically because of his amoral behavior. She was thoroughly disinterested in trying to improve him as a person. In fact, it was the exact opposite. She wanted him to bring her down to his level. When Rebecca becomes disillusioned by the mundane cruelty of high society, she quickly loses romantic interest in Nathaniel, though admittedly it doesn't help that her life was falling apart in multiple other ways at that time. And it's while Rebecca's life is falling apart that we establish the recurring dynamic of their relationship. That is, Nathaniel always enabling Rebecca to avoid her problems. While Nathaniel and Rebecca's relationship certainly bears many of the hallmarks of an I can fix him dynamic, it can be more accurately described as a he won't make me fix myself dynamic. The majority of their romantic interactions involve Nathaniel waving away any moral responsibility that he or Rebecca may have. He tried to run away with her during the Josh fallout, and when she came back and started treatment for her borderline personality disorder, he treated any fears she had of backsliding as not worth considering because the point of everything is to be happy, right? He engaged in an 8-month-long affair with her and treated the whole thing as though it were just some sort of inside joke. And while you could argue that Rebecca was not the one in the relationship and therefore bears less moral responsibility, the fact of the matter is she knew she was sleeping with someone who was in a serious relationship with someone else. And Rebecca's attempt at penance by going to prison was certainly misguided in a variety of ways, but Nathaniel's bid to plead insanity was just his way of brushing the whole circumstance under the rug. And when she gets home from prison but still feels that she needs to undergo some penance, Nathaniel acts like, to use a technical term, a big pissy baby about it. There was also that time that he manipulated Tucker in order to get closer to Rebecca, but then tried to play it off like it was somehow Tucker manipulating him. And having run down that laundry list, I might have given you the impression that I'm not the biggest fan of Nathaniel, but you would be mistaken. The point I'm trying to express is that Nathaniel is only able to improve as a person when he is no longer motivated by a desire to be with Rebecca. His car trip with Heather was the biggest turning point for his personality. It's after that point that he starts being pro-social with his co-workers and that he does work to materially improve the lives of marginalized people in his community. Similar to Josh, we learn in the finale that Nathaniel's attraction to Rebecca was always more about his own internal desire for redemption. Similar to Rebecca, he was set on a particular life path by his parents, only to realize as an adult that it left him feeling hollow. But he reaches his own self-actualization by pursuing something that is actually meaningful to him, using his legal skills to protect endangered wildlife. But he is only able to reach that self-actualization when he receives a full and final rebection. So that's it, folks. That's the stories that each of these three men represent. And what's that? What? Greg comes back?
So what if we met in another time and another place?
That's right, it was a plot twist all along. There was a secret fourth story that new Greg represents. And most of you probably figured that out by the fact that I hadn't talked about Greg's return to the show yet. The idea of getting a second chance with the right person who you met at the wrong time is something that is very inherently appealing. And Greg is very overtly used to represent the idea that if we grow and change enough as people, it can seem like we've transformed entirely. And when they meet again, seemingly as different people, Greg and Rebecca both want to put their past to the side. While they both recognize that they've made mistakes, they feel that dwelling on the past would prevent them from being able to build a future together. But in spite of how different Greg may seem to her, Rebecca is consistently confronted with the fact that he is still the same person. And that's the fundamental flaw with the second chance narrative, that no matter how much we feel like we've changed and atoned, there are some things in our past that can't just be dismissed. And this is where I hit you with the double plot twist, that in spite of the fact that new Greg might seem like he ought to represent a new narrative, the thing he's used to teach us is that if we try to ignore our history, we are ultimately destined to repeat the same mistakes. Their date at Raging Waters strongly parallels the events of Jame's wedding. Rebecca built up this outing in her own head as a once-in-a-lifetime experience that would bring her true happiness. And when Greg realized that he wasn't living up to her expectations, he pulled away from her for fear that she would reject him. And that pulling away reignited the feelings of abandonment that Rebecca already felt towards Greg, causing her to jump into the arms of Nathaniel and Josh. And while they tried to talk it out, they both felt like it was too much too soon and they needed to continue to focus on themselves rather than a relationship. And when he got roped into the 3-date plan, he came into it with a great deal of confidence. He and Rebecca have had their difficulties, but they've both grown and changed to the point where they might actually be good for each other. But when he was confronted with the fact that Rebecca was actually going on dates with the other two guys, his confidence wavered and he tried to become someone that he wasn't. And the irony of it all is that Greg stumbled into a date better than anything he could have actually planned, only when his own insecurities caused him to self-sabotage. Now, this video was originally conceptualized as me making an argument for why Greg has the most narrative basis to be the one who is in a relationship with Rebecca. And as I've spent more time with the show, my feelings have not changed, but they have clarified. I still think that Greg and Rebecca are the two most heavily paralleled members of the love quadrangle, but to choose sides is to misunderstand the point of the exercise entirely. Rebecca's journey of self-actualization is largely focused on her learning to find identity outside of romantic relationships. And a big part of that for her is realizing that she needs to stop thinking about other people in her life as playing roles in her story. So the ultimate lesson for the audience to take away is that trying to conceptualize our own relationships using these narratives as a framework is a betrayal of the complexity of real human beings. Life doesn't make narrative sense, and trying to force it to will only cause us to hurt ourselves and the people we love.